Welcome back, csc200 to ex11. This is our SpongeBob input because we're going to be inputting information and eventually working with our database, but we have an input form that we're working on an HTML page, and this is what it looks like so far. So it doesn't look very good so far. So we're going to fix that up with some CSS, and then we're going to get it working so that we can display it on a page with PHP. So let's go back to GORM, and to make it look nice so far, now let me explain a couple things here. I had some issues again with the gender, so what I did was I gave a class. You see this thing here? There's a div class. A div is just like an area in HTML. And I gave it a class name called radios. So it's a div with a class name of radios. And that's just a special name that I can give it. That's all that is. I just called it radios. I could have called it radio buttons or anything, but I called it radios. And then it ends at the end of where the radio buttons are. And that's just so I can move them all over. I wanted to move them over as a group. So I gave them a div and I called it a class of radios. So everything in this area is going to get moved over. And if you could see, here's the class of radios in my CSS. And it says position relative and it says left 100 pixels. What that means is if we set label, the original label, the position is absolute, then relative means it's going to move from that position. So this is kind of setting almost like the origin position in a way by putting absolute here for label in terms of our HTML. But the div of radios is going to be moved over 100 pixels from the left. That's why that stuff is moved over. And that's why this starts right there, because that's 100 pixels from there. See, it's about an inch, a little more than an inch over. So that's why that starts there already, or else they'd be on top of each other as well. So that's what's happening there. And then we also have this inputs. Now, I was just going to identify, you can see these are red and these are white. Now, these are HTML things. So the HTML form is basically changing the font size. It's using a sans serif font of Tahoma, second choice Arial, third choice Verdana, fourth choice anything that's sans serif. There's a margin left of 60 pixels. That's why this is moved over 60 pixels. So that's moved over 60 pixels, and then this is moved over 100 pixels from the label. So that's where that's setting up. And you can see the font here is all Tahoma right now. It's all kind of a sans serif font. So that's some of the CSS that's going on right now. Now, what we're also going to do, like I said, the label itself. Now, remember, the label are these things. These are the labels. And the labels is absolute, but the position of the other ones is going to be relative to the labels. So there's a class called inputs and a class called radios. Now radios is already exists. I already have a class, div class radios, so it's going to move over all those radio buttons 100 pixels. And that's what it's doing. Now inputs, I have a class called inputs, and it says position relative. It's doing the same thing, except if you look here, those inputs aren't moving over. They should be lined up with the radio button, but they're not. That's because they don't have a class name applied. So what you could do is you could go here and you could highlight class equals radios. And you could copy it. Now, you're not going to use radios, just let me point that out. But you're going to go in here and you're going to say input type equals text. And right in here, you're going to paste that, class equals radios. And you just need a space in between, like that. Except it's not going to be radios. It's going to be inputs, but you're not going to use the dot. You only use the dot to indicate that it's a class. Here, you indicate it's a class because you have the word class. So I'm going to say inputs. So my first one is going to be input type equals text, class equals inputs, meaning it's going to use that. And then everything else will stay the same. So if I save it and take a look at it, let's see what happens. You can see what happened. It moved that input over and it lines it up with the radio button. So that's what we want, except we didn't do it for last and we didn't do it for species. So we can just copy this, and now you can copy it with the spaces. If you copy it with the spaces and you copy it, do a Control C if you're on Windows, Command C if you're on Mac, and then go to the next input, not the label, but the input, and just go anywhere in between here and just paste that. Now, I think when I'm doing an extra space in here, so if you get an extra space, you can take it out. And then this one, I'm going to put this here. I guess I don't need the extra space in there, but we're going to have a space here, a space here. So these are all going to be class input, class inputs, class inputs. So they're all going to get the class inputs. So they're all going to get moved over now, and actually their font size is going to be a little bigger too. So if you go now and refresh that, you might say, well, the font size isn't any bigger. That's the font size that's going to show up in here. That's what I'm talking about. That's where that font size is. So the input is the font size in here. So these things aren't showing up any bigger. Now, nothing changed right there, so let me make sure I saved it. I don't think I saved it. I didn't, because it's still an asterisk. So let me make sure I save that. And now, when I go back and refresh it, now they all get moved over. Now, this one isn't moved over, so I can use that same class for submit. So I'll go down to submit, and I'll just put it in here. It doesn't matter where you put it. I usually put it after the type. I usually put the class after the type. And there's a space here and space here. So this is using class inputs as well. And I didn't save it, so make sure you save it before you refresh it. And now it should move the submit button over. Now they're still kind of jammed together vertically, so what we can do is add some space, maybe like a margin bottom or something. So we're going to add a margin bottom, and again, instead of doing it to all of these, we could just say inputs and put a margin bottom, margin dash bottom. And we're using margin instead of padding because we want it outside of the element, not inside the element. So I'll just do, I don't know, I'll try, we're using ems. Now, I didn't mention ems before, but ems is basically one character. So if it's 16 pixels is our point size, 1em is 16 pixels. So it's basically one character size. So maybe you want to do half that. So you could do something like 0.5em. Do half of that since we're using 1em as our font size. And if you want to change it, make it 0.7, try that. So I'll try that, and I'll save it. Make sure you save it, that you get an X there. And then I'll refresh it, and you can see what that did. It put a margin bottom below those. Now I need one below, looks like I need one below gender. So I can also just copy this and put it below the radios. Because remember, that's the class of radios. That whole area is a class of radios. So if I put margin bottom there, save this, and then I refresh it, now that looks pretty good. So that's pretty good so far. There's all kinds of things you could do with forms. You could put background colors and shadows and all kinds of things on here. But that's pretty much all we need right now. We want an input form that works. And if we click on here, you can see these things work. Radio buttons work so that there should be one selected. You can't select multiple ones. Checkboxes, you can have multiple checkboxes. You know, if you have a bunch of interests, you can check a bunch of interests. But for gender, typically there's only one gender that you can click here. So, and then when you're done, you hit the submit button. And nothing's happening now. Oh, it actually is. We actually have a page. So nothing's happening right now. That's actually working. But it's going to a new page, but we didn't do anything with our new page yet. So let me just go back to here, and I'll just leave that open. So it's actually working. Now, why is it working? It's working because we have form action equals display.php. Now, one thing you should put in here, you should say method equals post. You might say, well, how do you know that? Well, go in here, go into your forms, and just look at some samples, and eventually you'll see something with method equals post, what page it shows on. Here it is down here. Use the post method when submitting the form. And they say when to use get and when to use post. Actually, post is more secure. So if you stick with post, especially since we're doing a form, that's the best thing to do. So here it has method equals post. So I can even copy this, and you could just type it. It's not a big deal. But I'm going to put it in here, and make sure you just put a space in between. You don't want it right next to each other. But I'm going to do method equals post, even though it seemed to work without that. But in order for this form to process, we want method equals post. So we want that in there. And if you didn't have this, nothing would happen. But we have this in here, and we do have a display PHP page. So far, I think everything is working on this page. You want this page to look good and be lined up. So all we did right here is just kind of work with a little HTML. We have labels, and we have 3 inputs. We already had the stuff for the radio buttons, so that was already done for you. The only thing you did on the radio buttons was just change the value to M, F, and O instead of male, female, other. And then we put some classes in here to kind of align them up so they use these. So you kind of like target, you kind of give it a class, and then you target the class here. So if you couldn't target an HTML element, you just make up something. and then you could put it in there, and then you could target that. So we targeted the radio section, and then we target all the inputs. And you might say, well, why don't you just target an input element? Well, if I did that, it would have messed up our radio buttons because they're all input. So that's why I had to make classes here. So it's a little more complicated, but I think it looks nicer than filling in MF or O. Having a radio button makes more sense since it's kind of a choice. So that's our HTML and that's our CSS. So this is actually done. And this is actually working right now. And what we're going to do next, I guess I'll stop here, and on part 3 of this exercise, what we'll do is we'll take our information that we input in this form, we're going to input information in this form, and make it display on our display page. So right now, if I hit submit, it goes to this display page, but there's nothing here. But we're going to display stuff on this page, whatever we enter in here. Now, it's not going to connect to our database yet. That's going to be in our next exercise. But for now, we just want to display stuff so that we can go from one page to the other, so that our form is taking information and it's processing it with PHP, and it's taking it from the input form and displaying it here on a PHP page. Because remember, this is display.php. So that's what we're going to do in part 3.